Hey, a couple of people have commented asking how I got started in game dev or how they can get started in game dev, and while I don't have all the answers, I thought I'd make a video with just some of my own personal tips for how to get started or if you're beginning game dev. I want to start this video by saying I don't think there's a single best way to get into game dev, or anything really. So take any of these tips that work and just leave the rest. Don't think you have to do anything I say here if it doesn't vibe with you. Anyway, let's get into it with tip number 1. Okay, my first tip is maybe the most controversial, and that's to follow tutorials. People hate tutorials because you get stuck in what they call tutorial hell, but personally, I've done a lot of game dev tutorials and courses and I found them super helpful. I think there's a bit of a caveat with the tutorial thing though. You have to actually try to apply what you learn in the tutorial. You can do this by trying to build the thing before the person in the video does, or you can just try to branch out from the video, whatever works for you. But if you just mindlessly copy what the person is doing, you'll probably learn a lot slower. I honestly think tutorials are a really good way to get your feet wet and to actually start building something. Maybe you can't learn everything from them, but they at least get you writing code and making stuff, and the more you do of that, the better. Now I think every game dev tips video is obligated to say start small, but I don't entirely agree with this. Let me explain. A lot of advice you'll hear is to start small by recreating games like Pong or Asteroids. And I do think this is good advice because making games is way harder than you think it is, so you need to start super small if you expect to finish anything. And finishing games is super hard. Creating features for a game and finishing a game are almost like two separate skill sets. And starting small allows you to practice actually finishing games, but I personally would find no joy in just recreating Pong. So here's my advice. Build whatever you want and don't worry about starting small, but keep a few things in mind. By not finishing games, you're not practicing the skill of finishing, so just be aware that you're basically procrastinating your homework and you'll have to do it eventually. You'll probably get frustrated trying to implement a feature that you don't know how to implement yet, and that's okay. It's fine to just drop the project if it really gets frustrating and move on to something else. You probably won't finish anything for a while, and that's okay. You can practice just making portions of a game without ever actually finishing anything. I feel like when starting out in game dev, it's about quantity over quality. You just want to be building a lot of stuff without really worrying about it being good or releasing it. Think of every project like an experiment, not something you'll potentially release and make money from. Something I actually kind of see a lot from newer game devs is they get super excited about an idea, try to make it, share their progress, and then when something stumps them, they get super disheartened because they thought they'd be able to take this project all the way. If you remove the expectation to actually finish stuff and just think of every project as an experiment, then you can build a lot of little experiments and get a lot of experience. So go ahead and try to build that scientifically accurate open world dragon RPG or whatever it is you want to make, just don't expect to actually finish it. Tip number 3 is probably the next most common tip, but that's because it's so good. Do game jams. Game jams are fun. I admittedly don't do enough, but every time I've done one, I've really enjoyed it. The problem with game jams is there's a direct comparison at the end, and comparison is the thief of joy. If you stop trying to compete and allow yourself to just make something that sucks, I think you'll really find the benefit in them. When you're moving at game jam speeds, you don't really have time to overthink a feature or coding decision. You just have to do whatever you can to get the thing working, even if it's buggy, even if it's not scalable, and even if it's, God forbid, not optimized. This is such a valuable skill because when you have all the time in the world to code a feature, you start overthinking and prematurely optimizing, and game jams teach you how to just put code in the editor and not worry about it. Game jams also force you to practice the art of finishing games because ideally, you actually submit a functioning game. But don't be discouraged if you can't finish the game or if the game sucks. I think another psychological part of game jams is that you can sort of detach yourself from the outcome, because if your game is terrible, you always have the excuse of, well, if I had more time, it wouldn't suck so bad, so I'm not actually an idiot. And that's nice. So yeah, just go for it with game jams. Don't be afraid or overthink it. The worst thing that happens in a game jam is you just don't submit a game, and that's not that bad at all. Tip number 4 is probably the most eat your veggies style tip, and that's to learn to program. If you know how to code and you know basic programming concepts, game development becomes so much easier. I know this is rich coming from a person who spends 8 hours a day programming and gets paid to do it as a job, but just basic programming skills can go a long way. There are plenty of ways to learn to code, but the one I'm obviously going to recommend is the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Brilliant is the place where you learn by doing. They've got tons of courses in math, data science, and most importantly, programming. They have a course on Python, which is actually pretty similar to Godot's built-in programming language GDScript, and it's just a very common language in the industry. Python is cool, but they have a course on how to think like a programmer, which I actually think might be more useful. Once you know how to solve problems programmatically, learning different programming languages is just learning slightly different syntax. I currently use Golang, JavaScript, and GDScript every day, and apart from occasionally adding curly braces where they're not needed, all of my knowledge transfers between them seamlessly. Brilliant has an app too, so you can learn this stuff on the go. Instead of just mindlessly scrolling, you can learn programming. I try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days. Use my link, brilliant.org/LandonDevelops. You can also scan the QR code or click the link in the description. You'll get an additional 20% off an annual membership. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring the video. My fifth and final tip is a bit out of left field, but hear me out. This is sort of an extension of the start small tip, but this is how I would make it more fun. Take arcadey games that are already fun, rip off the main concept, and then add stuff around it. Something I find deeply satisfying in game dev is taking a simple arcadey game like Space Invaders or Pong, and then turning it into an RPG. Or take a game like Asteroids and add a story, or make it a roguelike. This is basically just a way to start small, since the main gameplay portion of the game will just be recreating an already existing game, but it makes it less boring by adding upgrades, a storyline, a roguelike aspect, whatever. Games like this can also end up being really fun too. So try it out, and if you finish something, drop a link in the comments and I'll play it. Anyway, there are 5 tips for getting started in game dev. Again, there's no real right or wrong way to start any sort of hobby or project. What works for me may not work for you. But if you have any other tips, feel free to drop them in the comments. Maybe they'll help someone else out. I think the most important thing is just to start. Just make stuff. So yeah, close YouTube, go out and just start making stuff.